And we'll immediately shift to Karim Shafei from Al Ismailia for real estate investment. Do you want to try the clicker? If it doesn't work, you can tell me now. Let's see. Okay.
Thank you, Mohammed, and thank you, William. That was very inspiring. So I suspect that quite a few people know a little bit about Ismailia. So I'm not going to take too much time introducing the company. We were established in 2008 with the purpose of buying the old real estate in downtown and reviving the area. I would just like to start by talking about gentrification, since this is the big topic that we're discussing in those 2 days. And I cannot present anything that Lucy has not presented. I'm going to actually quote a lot of her statements and use some of her terms. Just to go very quickly, gentrification is not new to downtown. First, there was the wave of building in the medieval times, and then the first half of the century, which Lucy very well explained, including the small or the minor gentrification that happened of the middle class moving into downtown. Then there was the Nasser era, and then the open door policy, and eventually she walked us into the 2000s. The two things that I just wanted to add to what Lucy had presented about downtown is, first of all, in Egypt in the 80s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, there was a split in the society. There were two definite cultures that we could notice at the time. One is a very Western culture that is attached to an American consumerism model, very, very attached to that. And then there was a very Islamic model. And even if you remember the names of the brands of clothing or of restaurants, or it was either an American name, so it's a daily dress or Mobako, or it was an Islamic name, so Al-Isra' lil-Sirafa, or Al-Isra' lil-Ma'raj lil-Rahalat Siyahiyya, and so on and so forth. Now, in the second half of the 1990s started, and I quote here Lucy again, the Egyptianization of the Egyptian society. Basically, it moved back to the roots. And coincided with that is the movement in the contemporary art scene, which William was talking about. And there was a very new, modern, and vibrant art scene that was building in the 1990s, late 90s and early 2000s, which included Townhouse, but later on we saw CIC come into the picture, we saw Studio Ahmed al-Din, we saw Mawrid al-Saqafi, and all this was happening basically in downtown. And also I heard somebody saying that the revolution, the January Revolution, created a lot of art, but I would like to debate that and say that actually a lot of the art and the movements that were happening in the early 2000s are what generated and resulted in the revolution itself. And this is when we as Ismailia came in. We came in 2008, and basically we wanted to tap into those two trends that were happening, the Egyptianization of Egypt and a move by the contemporary art scene back into downtown. Now, if you ask a lot of the people sitting in this room what they think Ismailia is doing, they would show you that. So basically, Ismailia is coming to eat the residents. It's coming to flatten the art scene and abuse of the neighborhood. So I take this opportunity to show you our perspective and a slightly different way of thinking and where we're coming from, and explore with you, hopefully over those 2 days, what we can do together, being one of the stakeholders, just like the artists and the masculine-dominated streets and the stores and so on and so forth. So let me skip this one. I'd just like to talk about Ismailia when it came into downtown, how we found downtown in 2008. It was basically falling apart. So put aside the few artists and art institutions that moved into downtown in that period, in 2008, downtown was falling apart on so many levels. First, legally, the buildings are owned by what used to be 2 or 3 people are now owned by 50, 60, 70 heirs. In some cases, we had to negotiate with 130 people to buy their buildings. Also, the tenants in those buildings had moved so many generations that today you'd have sometimes an apartment that is, the title of the rent is to 8 or 9 people at the same time, and they cannot benefit from that. Only one of them is benefiting from that. The ownerships were messed up, the legal contracts were messed up, so one of the things that we contributed to was to put together all that legal mess. The second thing is that the buildings were degenerated completely. Infrastructure, the facades, even all the services such as elevators and so forth were falling apart. And from an urban perspective, it was a ghost town. Actually, in our buildings, on average, 30% of the space was vacant, completely vacant. We got the keys when we bought the building. 20% was locked. A lot of people who had contracts, but they were just paying their $6, $7, £10 a month and living somewhere else. And then if we looked at the other half of those buildings, what was remaining was 90% occupied with offices, lots of them, and some commercial activities such as warehouses and small workshops. Lots of these companies were established in the 70s, import-export companies with very little employment, and most of them closed at 3, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And the city was dead, basically. After, forget about the retail space, anything that is above the retail space was completely deserted after 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And then if you looked at the retail, it was very it was focusing on one single segment. It's not a retail that is diversified, that is addressing different segments of the society. It's only focusing on one specific market. And we came in that environment, and we managed to buy some of the most beautiful buildings in downtown. Now, I'd like to share with you our vision for downtown going forward. We envision a downtown that is available for everyone. We think about downtown, and again, I'm quoting Lucy, when she talked about a downtown that was accessible by everyone. Back in, you talked about the 30s, 40s, and 50s, where it was a downtown that had middle class, upper class. It was accessible by even the lower economic segments of the society. It was a melting pot of all the segments. We don't think that this is the case in downtown today. We think that, like I said, the buildings are empty, the retail is addressing only one segment, and other than that, the city is empty. So we talk, when we say a downtown for all, we want to talk about two things. And here again, I refer to an earlier discussion, which is the brick and mortar versus people, and we think on those two levels. One is we want to create the space, so basically refurbish the buildings and upgrade them and find new functions for them. And two is invest in activities and ideas that bring people back into downtown. And by saying bringing people back, we're talking about the wider population of Cairo. In terms of creating the space, we obviously look at refurbishing those buildings and bringing them back to what they looked like historically. So we do a lot of research on the architecture and the type of building material and so forth. But we also talk about creating the space in the sense that we find new functions for the space. So this is, for instance, the Radio Theater, which was abandoned for about 10 or 12 years. And at large, the industry of plays, attending plays, has died in Egypt in the past years. I mean, in the 70s, we had 80s and 90s, there were a lot of plays, and then it completely died. So we had to reinvent, find a new use for it, and this is when Bassem Youssef took over the theater for about a year and a half, and then today it hosts Abla Fahira, and we're thinking and we're seeing how else we can use that space. And then one of the things that we focused on, and we continue to focus on, is cooperating with the art scene to bring people back into downtown. So sometimes we start our own initiatives. For instance, DCAF is one of the things that we co-established with Ahmed Al-Attar in Studio Ahmed Al-Din, and now it's in its 5th year. Sometimes we have leased spaces to important art organizations. Instead of asking you to come to 6th of October, we came to you. And so Townhouse, CIC are examples of institutions who are hosted in some of our buildings. Sometimes we have given the space to artists and art events that were happening. A lot of these events happened in our buildings, Le Caire Mon Amour, the Studio Vinoise, etc. And over the past 8 years, I think we've hosted maybe 30 or 40 different events. And sometimes we also invest in urban projects. So we've worked with Cluster, for instance, on mapping of the passages in downtown and finding solutions for them. We've worked on, we've sponsored the documentation of downtown and Cairo. Let's talk about heritage. Finally, I would just like to say that Ismailia is a profit-seeking company. We are a company that is out there to make money. And we chose to do that because that's the only way to preserve the buildings and to preserve the urban fabric of downtown. We don't think that the government can just throw money at it or people can just donate to keep downtown. If there's no real economic benefit behind it, then it's not going to go anywhere. And however, we also recognize and we hope that the way we develop downtown is through engagement with other stakeholders, because we don't believe in a downtown that is exclusive. We don't believe in a top-down approach. We would like to work organically with the users in downtown. So we talked a lot in previous conferences and with different groups on the side on creating an NGO or a board of trustees that would overlook downtown from an architectural point of view, an urban, and to encourage investments in downtown, to set a vision for it and work on creating the public space there. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karim. And